Hi, my name's Stewart Lynch, and my worst nightmare happened. 7 days before I was scheduled to present a talk at Deep Dish Swift in Chicago, I went on a cruise, and after one day on the ship, I started feeling sick. Not seasick, but congestion, constant coughing, and a sore throat. And then it just went down the hill from there. I thought I'd get better, but after getting off the ship, still feeling like crap, I took a COVID test and tested positive. So likely my one and only chance to present at a Swift conference comes to an end. During the preparation for this talk, I did record myself though, so this is what I would have presented, hopefully with some edits and with more energy than what it sounds like in this preparation. I do want to offer my sincere apologies to the Deep Dish Swift organizers and all the attendees, but I simply couldn't subject everyone there to this virus.
So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I spent 32 years in education, the first 11 years as a classroom teacher teaching math and computer science, and then I spent 2 years in a roving position. This was back in the early 80s where technology or computers were just making their way into the classroom. So I was hired to go around to different schools teaching teachers and students how to use and make use of that technology within the classroom. Then I got some administrative experience as a vice principal, worst job in the system. And then I was able to secure an administrative role as a director of technology in that school district, had a huge staff of 1. Spent 4 years there, and then another school district made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Was able to move there, spent 12 years, and had a much larger staff, and was responsible for overseeing the technology as it applied to both the educational and the business side of things. So I stayed there until 2007 when I decided to take an early retirement. And I spent 7 years in the private sector working for a company called OpenText, where I was a trainer and what was called a senior services engineer. But I also created value-added tools using using the proprietary BASIC-like language and later on JavaScript for web-based tools. But in 2014, the division was downsized and I was laid off. I was made redundant. So now I was really retired. I have the ability now to do what I wanted, when I wanted, and more importantly than that, nothing was my problem anymore. I was responsible for myself. So what else happened in 2014 and what would I do with myself? So this was the year in 2014 that Swift was released. So I always wanted to be an iOS developer, so I jumped right in. And since 2014, I've been building and putting iOS apps on the App Store. For the first 5 years, it was all UI kit. And then in 2019, when SwiftUI was released, I jumped right in. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And then when COVID hit in 2020, I thought that I'd use my teaching skills to show people all the mistakes and the missteps that I'd made along the way. I call myself a self-directed learner. I don't consider myself self-taught because I learn from other people. I'm not smart enough to teach myself. So the YouTube channel has been running since 2020. It's been fairly well received. Occasionally I get a strange comment on my YouTube videos. Don't quite know how to take this one, but he seems to think I've got one step in the grave. But when you count the years, I started work when I was 24, taught or was in education for 32 years, spent 7 years in the private sector, been retired for 10. Well, you add those numbers up and they count up to 73. And in fact, I had my 73rd birthday on May the 2nd. However, I'm still younger than both candidates for President of the United States this fall. So I guess I'm doing okay. But really, in my mind, I think I look more like this 20-year-old here in this picture. This is what I look like. I had lots of hair, and I thought that as I grew older, I'd look like this. Unfortunately, I lost my hair at an early age. I'm this bald old guy, and my avatar demonstrates that. So I was listening to a Swift Over Coffee podcast one day, and this one had a quote from Paul Hudson. Swift Over Coffee, you don't listen to it, it's with Paul Hudson and Michaela Karen. And it resonated with me because every day I learn something new, or perhaps I've forgotten and I think I'm learning something new, but nevertheless, I learn something new every day. So what I wanted to do in this talk was to share with you some of those things that I learned in my daily perusing of different content. Now, not all of the tips that I'm going to share with you are coding related, but hopefully they're things that you will do on a regular basis related to your coding. I just found them really interesting. Now, some of these things may seem really trivial to you, and you may wonder why everyone else doesn't know that already. But I can guarantee that for at least one person out there, these nuggets will be new. And they are new to me when I discovered them. So no heckling, please. So the first one I want to share with you is something that I discovered about Bindable. Now, I'm old school, so I just don't show you the nugget. I have to build up to it. Now, this is new in the observation framework that was released last year. And with the observation framework, you can have an object like this person. And if that object, in this example, I can have an array of people like this. And then what I can do is I can create an observable class called store and watch any changes on that array of people or person. So it gets initialized when the class is initialized. And we can inject that into the environment when the app launches. So once it's in the environment, I have access to it in all of my views like I do here. And so I can present that list of people and present their names in a list like this. No problem. I have access to the store's array of people. The problem with the observation framework that was introduced is that if I want to change that text view, to a text field, so that I can edit those names in line, we get an error. And the error says it can't find store in scope. Well, it's right there. Where is it? Well, with the observation framework, what we're told is that we need to add a property wrapper and assign a new variable called store, and to it assign the environments version. And then we no longer have an issue and we're able to edit within the list. And I always found that that was a very strange construct. In fact, I filed the feedback on that at Apple shortly after WWDC saying surely there must be a mistake. Well, it turns out that it's not a mistake, but there is another way of doing things. You can remove Bindable altogether and simply then remove within that list for each loop, if you like, remove the $sign and simply wrap the environment variable in a Bindable. And then everything edits just as properly, or just as it would. Not a problem. And this is something I had never seen anyone else do before until I saw it in a book by J.D. Gauchat in his excellent SwiftUI for Masterminds book. Another thing here that I learned is something that I had never seen before either. So let's take a look at this inventory where I've got an ID to make it identifiable, but name and quantity. And I've got a static array that's a typical coder's wardrobe, if you like, hats, t-shirts, and shorts. And if I want to display those in a list, I can iterate over that inventory item. And then if I want to display the item and the quantity in a list view, this is typically what one might do. The text view label, a spacer, and then the quantity on the right-hand side. Well, we could change that. Instead of using an H stack with a spacer, we could change it to a labeled content view, which gives us the same thing. It'll capture the entire width of the container that was presented to it and spread that content, the quantity item, to the right-hand side. I always find it strange in labeled content and other constructs where the label is second, yet it gets presented first. So rather than do it this way, what I discovered was there is another way. I can simply use that text using the item name and then just apply a badge and provide the quantity. And that works well just if you've got any kind of an integer value that is a quantity item. And this is a tip that I learned in LinkedIn and Enid's Learn and Code with Enid's tips. And he's got a ton of them. So really worthwhile following him on LinkedIn. So keeping in line there with alignments, when we have an object that's presented within a container, it's going to center itself within the container. And typically, if you want to push that off to the right-hand side, you can embed it in an H stack and place a spacer in front to push it off to the right-hand side. Well, I've changed how I do those kinds of placements and alignments. Instead of using H stacks and V stacks and spacers, I now use a frame. And with a frame, we can set the max width to be infinity and then just set the alignment. And this is going to allow me to push it to the trailing edge or the leading edge simply by changing the trailing alignment or the alignment. So the advantage to this is instead of max width, I could choose max height, and that's going to allow me to align it to the top or the bottom. Or even better than that, I can add another max width in here, and now I've got 4 corners from which I can align my text or my view within another container. To me, this is much easier to deal with, easier to read than trying to use something like this. And even though I knew this, I never really used it until I watched a video by Rebelliper where he drilled this home. Oftentimes we've got strings with quantities, and associated with that string is some kind of a label, and we want to have some sort of a grammar agreement so that when I increment that integer number, the label will get changed to have grammar agreement. So 0 person should be 0 people, 3, 4 people, but 1 person. So how do we go about getting that grammar agreement without actually coding it or necessarily changing our code so much? Well, there's a couple of different ways of doing this. And one way is to use inflection. And it's kind of cryptic the way that this works. And I'd never ever seen this before. But once you understand it, it's not that difficult to remember. Simply within the quotes of your text view, you just surround it with square brackets, preface it with a caret, and then at the end of the square bracket say you want an inflection rule that's true. And then when you do that, as you start to increment the number, the grammar agreement will take care of itself. You don't have to do anything within the code to try and check and change that person to people. Xcode will handle that for you. Trouble is, that was something that I learned in a post from Paul Hudson, Hacking with Swift. Now, the trouble is that this doesn't deal well or doesn't work well when you've got multiple languages. And if you're wanting to localize your code, or even if you don't want to localize your code, I find that this is a much better way of dealing with things. I don't want to touch that text view. Instead, what I can do is I can create a string catalog just by going to File, New, and getting a string catalog and accepting the localizable. And it's going to automatically generate now a list of all of the strings for me, currently in English only, but you could add multiple languages. And any one of the strings that you have that has some kind of a value associated with it that is going to increment or change, you now have the ability to right-click. You've got this %LLD. You can right-click and choose Vary by Plural. And when you do that, you get both options. You get the 1, which is for the number 1, which would be 1 person. And then for other, we need to decide what's it going to be. So if it's 0, it's people. If it's -1, people. If it's 2, people, and so on. So all the other cases, the word I want to use is people. And when I come back now to my view, without changing it at all with the string catalog, and if I increment, it'll automatically have that grammar agreement working for us. If I've got an array of strings like this, and I want to present these in a list, maybe have a search view, and you've got some sort of a search string that's where you enter your text, and like OR, and what do I get if I do this filter on contains? I only get Lorne. Why? Because lowercase OR isn't the same as uppercase OR. You all know that. So how do you fix that? Well, what I've done, coming from my background, is I would always take the iterator, the $0, and make it lowercase, and then make the search string lowercase, and compare the two lowercase versions. Works like a charm. I get Lorne and Orla. Well, again, this doesn't scale well in multiple languages because I used to work a lot in Sweden. Go to Sweden, there are people named Bjorn, for example, where there's this umlaut over the O. When I try and do my lowercase, it misses OR in the Bjorn. Well, what I discovered was that instead of using this lowercase and messing it all up, it's even easier. I can go back to my iterator and filter on, instead of contains, filter on localized standard contains using that search string. And then we get all 3 matches in our filter. And this is something that was taught to me by Natalia Pamfernova, Nil Coalescing, former Apple employee that now works in New Zealand. So in this example here, I've got a profile view that is using label content and dynamic text. and it looks pretty good. However, if I have people that have my app and they start to change the size of their default text because it's dynamic, the higher or the larger that text gets, it soon becomes unreadable. And in fact, the text becomes truncated. You can't even read it at all. So a solution then is to introduce ViewThatFits. And with ViewThatFits, you can provide your view a couple of choices. So the first case, which is going to be the default, is, yeah, just give me that profile view. But if it doesn't fit, embed that profile view in a scroll view. And then when I do that, and they increase their text, it turns into a scroll view, and the scroll view will provide enough room to not have to truncate those texts, those strings. Well, I would like to use this a lot, and I don't want to have to always embed things in a view that fits. So what I could do instead is create a view modifier. So don't underestimate the power of view modifiers. With a view modifier, you get the content, which is the view that you're modifying, and you can return that content, but you can also do whatever you want to that content. So I could say, well, let's embed that in a view that fits and use the content twice. Once if it fits, and if not, embed it in a scroll view. And while I'm at it, let me just add some default content margins so that it can separate the content from the scroll indicators and so on. And then to make it really Swifty, I'll create an extension on view and create that as a scroll if necessary that simply returns the modifier applying that view modifier scroll if necessary. So then when I go back to my view, instead of having to take that view that fits, I can remove it completely and then just add the modifier onto that profile view, and it'll automatically turn into a scroll view if necessary. And this was something that I learned from Majid and in one of his blog posts. Now, here's another example of how powerful that view modifiers can get. Here I've got a similar problem where I have a stack view that if I and the view that I'm presenting is centered on the screen. If I add another one, it's centered, and so on. Everything is centered. You're always getting presented with that content in the center, but it doesn't scroll. So one of the solutions would be to simply embed this in a scroll view. The trouble when you embed something in a scroll view, if there's only one item, it's pushed to the left-hand side. But as you increment, it scrolls and you see all of the content. So what we could do is go back to our view that fits view modifier, the scroll if necessary, and provide another variable or another property argument called axes, and then just simply add that axis that gets passed into the scroll view. But because we don't want our initial one to break within the arguments for the scroll if necessary, we'll specify that the axis is by default vertical, and then apply that one to the view modifier so our first view won't break. But if I go back to this view, what I can do is I can say, okay, let's scroll if necessary with an axis that's horizontal. And in that case, then it starts off as an H stack, but as soon as I get beyond the ability to view that H stack in the view, it scrolls or it moves out into a horizontal scroll view. Perfect. Markdown is something that I have used sparsely, but I'm starting to see the power of it, and I ran into a problem. Here I've got a text view where I'm using bold, welcome, italics, deep dish Swift, but I don't always want to have this fixed text here. It may come from somewhere else in a constant like this, where I've got the string where I've formatted it with Markdown text. But when I replace the text view with that greeting, it's displaying it verbatim. That doesn't work. And the reason is, if you look at the initializer for a text view, you see that it is a localized string key. It's not a string. So I can simply go back to the greeting where I define that greeting and make it a localized string key, and then it displays perfectly. The trouble is, I might have this string coming from structs and classes or databases. They could come from anywhere, and I don't want to have to mark those properties as localized string keys. I want them to be string. So I can remove the localized string key here and simply go back to the greeting and say, look, use the text views initializer which is a localized string key, and it'll convert that text to a localized string key and display it properly. And this was another tip provided by Natalia Pamfernova. Now, enums are my favorite user-defined data type in Swift. They can serve multiple purposes, especially if you want to use them as optional identifiable objects to trigger a modal sheet in a presentation. Trouble is that if I'm going to use it to trigger a modal sheet, it has to be identifiable. And if it's identifiable, it won't conform unless I have an ID property. And the simplest way to do that is simply to say that the ID is of type self and just return self. Now, the issue you're going to get is if that has an associated value, like in this case. In this case, then we can't return self. So you could return a string and instead say, return the string describing self. And that works fairly well. However, this describes every single property and value of the associated type. And the enum's not entirely if it's not entirely hashable, there may be some issues. And I'd rather keep just contact and account detail as my identifiable strings, my IDs. So what can be done is you can instead, let's that full description be that string describing self, and then break that full description up by components using that less than, or the left parentheses as the component. So in the case of contact, there is none, but in account detail, there is one, and the first component is account detail. So we can return the full description components separated by the left parentheses. And if there is one, we'll return the first. Otherwise, we'll return the full description. So that's a big mouthful to use. Instead, we can create a protocol called Identifiable Enum that conforms to the identifiable protocol as an ID, create an extension on the Identifiable Enum, and do exactly the same thing within here. Create that full description, return the component or the full description. So now that I've got that, I can go back to that enum, the one that I used with my constructed ID, and simply remove that ID and change that instead to an identifiable enum. And this is really slick. And it was something that was, it can also be used even if there is no associated values, like in this case here. Simply just make it an identifiable enum. And that was a tip courtesy of Scott Smith, where he posted this on X. So I use, as I said, enums all the time. And Jessie Linden presented a talk on enums and Swift leads last year. And if you get a chance to watch it, I really would recommend it. And she credited me with this particular tip. And, you know, I've flogged it so many times in my videos that even I believe it. Kind of like American politics. If you say it often enough, you start to believe that you're even yourself. Although it's not true. I don't remember ever coming up with this, but then again, I don't remember who taught it to me. So if I want to trigger a presentation of a modal sheet, I can use an optional identifiable enum. Like, here's my enum. Let's give it a couple of associated values and make it an identifiable enum. So then I can use this to trigger some sort of a presentation to show a color or show a string. So back in my view, I'll need a state property where I have that optional view type. And then in the actions for my buttons, I can specify that a view type is either a color, where I can specify a color, or it could be a string case, in which case I'll have to present a string. And then what I can do then, because I'm going to be changing the value from optional to non-optional for that view type, I can present a sheet, and I will get it bound to the optional item that now gives me that view type. And that view type, if I switch on it, is going to provide me with the associated values that I can use to present a view. Just like this. So here's the part that people are crediting to me. I suggest that what you can do is you can remove all of that stuff from the content of that sheet. Go back to your enum and say, look, at this enum, not only can it be an identifiable enum, it can also be a view. And a requirement for a view is that there has to be a body property that is some view. Well, that some view is that switch statement where we switch not only on view type, we're switching on whatever case this view type is. And once we have that information, our body is going to actually present either the color or the text with the associated value string. So that's our view. The enum is itself its view. So this view type is going to be the view that's going to get presented. And because we're not doing anything with that view type, we can simply change it to $0. I think it's much cleaner and much easier to read. Now, this is, in my opinion, a brilliant trick. Let's say you have a view that is a tag and you want to allow users to choose the background color like I'm showing you here with this color picker. If the foreground color is white, it looks good for dark colors. But the lighter you get on your background, the less readable that foreground or that text view's label is. So what I learned was that there is this property called luminance. And with luminance, you can extract the RGB colors from a UI color. So we can convert our color into a UI color. And then we can extract the RGB values. And then you can perform this calculation that's going to return some sort of a value between 0 and 1. 0 is a dark color, black. 1 is a light color, white. And all other colors follow somewhere in between. So what you can do then is you can say, well, let me adapt my background color based on that luminance, or the foreground color that I'm going to use for my label based on the luminance of that background color. So if it's closer to white, I'm going to return black. If it's closer to 0, I'm going to return white. So then I can go back to my view and that foreground style, which is my label's color, I can change that to the background's adaptive text color. And now no matter what I choose, that label is going to appear with an appropriate foreground style. And you can even fine tune that even more. So this was something that was presented by Swift and Tips, Pete, on his, I think I saw this on X. And this one here went right by me as well. Here I've got a picker that presents a list of cities. And when you change that city, you want to fetch the weather, which is going to require this asynchronous fetch weather function. So what I could do is create an onChange, watch for changes of that selected city. It's an optional value, so I first unwrap it, and then I can create a task unit of work, and within that task unit of work, I can await the return results of the fetch for weather. That selected city, and it's going to present the weather to me. And this is what I used in all of my earlier tutorials. That's what I've been using for structured concurrency. But what I discovered was that instead of onChange, I can simply use a task with an ID property. And when you have a task with an ID property, it's now going to give you an asynchronous unit of work. So this task that we have here within the body is not necessary. You can return it or remove it completely, and now you're going to get exactly the same result. And this was recently something that had been posted on Twitter by Muhammad Azam, who's here today. And I first discovered by watching videos from TuneStep. So as I said, not all of the tips that I'm going to show you here are necessarily code related, but in Xcode, if you option click on a symbol, you'll end up getting the ability to get the QuickHelp. And it's getting better at Apple. It actually is really good. But what's even better is you can do option command 0, option command 3 to remove or to display the inspector. And then with that inspector, you now have the QuickHelp that's available to you all the time. And every time you click on a different symbol, you're going to get that QuickHelp in that view that you have right at your fingertips, right in front of you, that you can copy that text from. So this was something that I learned from Sihat Gundas. Here's a real quick one, Swift previews. Did you know that if you do Command-Shift-A and you get your quick actions, you can search for export, and that's going to allow you to export a screenshot of the preview. And you can save that to your desktop, bring it into your graphics program, and add your own frame to it. Don't need to run things in the simulator or on the iPhone. You can get it directly from the preview. And that was something that Peter Fries brought to our attention. This is something I see people do all the time. If they want to switch to a directory, they'll open a terminal window, go CD, drag and drop the folder to the directory, and then they can issue their git commands or whatever they want to do within that directory. Well, that's a lot of work to do. You have to open a new window, drag and drop. What's even better though is if you have a Finder window open, you can expose the path to where you are. And if you look at the bottom of the Finder window here, you'll see that I've got the path directly from the root up to my interval pal. And if you don't see that, just go to your Finder, go to the View options and choose Show Path Bar. And when you do that, you can now simply just right-click on that path and then choose Open in Terminal directly. It'll navigate to the directory and you can start to issue your commands right away. Easy peasy, not a problem. Right-click, Open in Terminal. And you'll notice that when I'm going and using my git commands, I'm getting code completion. And that's because I'm using Amazon's Code Whisperer, formerly Fig, but it's great for me. Custom symbols are fantastic, although there are some limitations. Let me give you an example. Here I've got a figure where you have a walking person, but that figure also has a component that is this triangle with an exclamation mark in it. I'd like to use a figure who's hiking, but there is no corresponding equivalent symbol. So if I want to display this hiker on the screen, I can add some modifiers to it, but I want to have that triangle down there as well. What you can do is you can go back now to custom symbols and easily just right-click on the figure here that you want, say duplicate the custom symbol, and once you've got it in the custom symbols window, you can right-click on it and say combine the system with a component, and it'll offer to you all of the different components, including that triangle one that is at the bottom right-hand side. So I can create a symbol with that component. And then you can export that symbol, and it's going to allow you to export it to wherever you want. Let me export it to my desktop. And I can simply drag that into my assets folder of my project. And now you see inside my project, I have this symbol image. And if I go back to my code window then, I don't have a symbol, but because of the new symbol creation of autocomplete, whatever you want to call that, if I just go period, it's going to display for me that image resource as well that I can simply select, and I can apply these same modifiers, but because it's a custom symbol, I can also say I want the rendering mode to be original, and I get exactly what I want. And this is something that I discovered through a post from Jenny later on Mastodon. Now, this one is something that bugged me all the time. If I want to stretch a window, I have to get in that vertical bar and then try and stretch it to expand till I can see everything that's in the Finder window. And what I didn't realize is that if I just want to right click on a window or on the vertical bar, I get an option to right size that column. It can right size it exactly. Just right click, right size this column. And if you want to right click and resize all, you can do a similar thing, but choose not the right size all columns equally, but right size all columns individually, and everyone will get expanded to exactly the size that you want. And the final one here is this one on Safari search bar. If you click in the search bar where the URL is and you remove that URL, you get this little magnifying glass here right at the beginning of the search bar. If you tap on it, you can choose which of the different search engines you want to use within that search. Never knew that. And that was something that was posted by Steve Troughton-Smith. Mastodon. So how do I find these nuggets? Well, I spend the greater part of my early mornings on social networks like X or Mastodon, primarily now Mastodon. But I also view Threads and more so LinkedIn. There are other services, but I'm too old for them. And what I do is I find people that I want to get information from and I follow them. And so I recommend to you that if you're looking for finding good content on any service, just find the people you admire and see who they follow and start to follow the people that they follow. And check to see if they have a list. You can do that on X like I have and specify just exactly who you want to follow or create a list for. Or you can take a look at newsletters because there's a ton of them. Quality newsletters being delivered to your mailbox by any number of great posts and great people. Those people also are bloggers, many of them, or there's others that don't have newsletters but just produce blogs. Wonderful content here. I apologize to those that I've left off this list. And there are a whole number of books that you can get. Paul Hudson is always keeping his up to date. I got every one of his. I've got all of Mark Moykin's. I'm a Codico subscriber. I get Daniel Steinberg's books, Thinking in SwiftUI, all of Donnie Wall's books, and many more as well. I spend a lot of money on content and purchasing books from other content providers. I listen to podcasts all the time. I walk a dog. It's a great way for me to learn new ideas, and not just coding, but all sorts of developer-related concepts through this is just a sampling of some of those podcasters. And of course, YouTubers. There's just a ton of people putting out content for free on YouTube. And again, this is just a sampling of some of the people that I follow and watch their videos on a regular basis. And of course, I've got my own channel, and I've recently developed an app that you can download if you wanted to, that gives you a searchable list of all of the content that I have on my YouTube channel, along with my video links and links to all of the starter projects and completed source code. And you can watch those videos in line. So how do I curate the content? Well, I used to use Notion, and Notion has a search Safari extension that allows you to capture, and it'll post that to a page, a Notion page that you have. Trouble is, it's going to post it in a list, but it's not going to categorize it. And you have to go in after the fact to categorize it. So there are a couple of better options. One is something called Bridges, and that was created by Jonathan Ruiz. And that has a Mac, an iPhone, and an iPad client. And there's also Plinky, which is currently in test flight by Joe Fabisevich of Red Panda Club. Again, has 3 different options for sharing. Myself, what I now have standardized on is Raindrop.io. And Raindrop.io has a great iPad client that allows you to use the share sheets. And when the share sheet pops up, you can leave a note about that particular thing, and you can file it into any one of the containers that you've already got pre-organized, or you can create new ones on the fly. And the iPad app has exactly the same format. Similarly, the Mac app allows you to get that content there. And then, so once you've captured that, you can then use the dedicated iPad client to get access to that same content and view it within their own web browser, or share that content with others. You can use the iPhone client to do exactly the same thing and share it with others. I primarily use the Mac client when I'm organizing my videos. I can go in there and make notes and edit. I can view in line with their web view in line. There is a reader view. And better yet, there is this permanent copy that if the original content is no longer available online, you can read the permanent copy that it's saved, or you can simply open it in a browser. Whew. Okay, so that's all of the tips and how I get access to those tips that I wanted to, or have time to share with you today. You can find me anywhere, basically, at Stewart Lynch. Here's a link to my YouTube channel. And here's a link to the social networks that I belong to. And next Sunday, I'll have recorded this entire talk myself, and it'll be one of the videos that's going to come out next Sunday in my YouTube. Thanks for watching me.